J.D. Vance absolutely dismantles this crooked reporter from ABC News. You guys have got to check this out.
Vice presidential nominee, Senator J.D. Vance. So happy to have you here this morning, Senator Vance. I know you've been going hard on the campaign trail, but I want to start with the hurricane. During Hurricane Helene, as we heard, former President Trump suggested the federal government was not only sending FEMA aid meant for the hurricane to migrants, but going out of their way to not help people in Republican areas. Do you think that is true?
Well, Martha, what the president said is that fundamentally FEMA aid is distracted by going to illegal migrants. And by the way, good morning, and thanks for having me. We've got Republican congressmen who are on the ground who represent that area saying that they have to call the White House to get food and water to FEMA. I don't frankly think there's anything malicious going on here, Martha, but I do think that we've had an incompetent response to this particular crisis, particularly in Western North Carolina, which, to be fair, was hit harder than a lot of us expected it. But fundamentally, if you've got 6 days after the hurricane, the 82nd Airborne is still trickling in, I do think that we had a fundamentally incompetent, overly bureaucratic response to the hurricane. So what you hear from folks on the ground is they feel left behind. And Martha, we have to remember, of course, I know this area well. This is the Appalachian region of our country where people have felt ignored by their government for 30 years, and it doesn't help when you have a response to the hurricane that's slow, that's halting, and then you layer on top of it, of course,
Senator Vance
has done a lot.
Senator Vance, I want to go back to
resettlement work. Go ahead.
I want to go back to what former President Trump said. He said they're going out of their way to not help people in Republican areas. There is no truth to that. And on staging, Pentagon officials say that active duty troops were staged and ready to go before being called upon and were instantly out the door. So President Trump, former President Trump, is saying things that aren't true about that money being withheld from Republican areas.
Well, Martha, I think you're actually confusing staging of resources from the rapid response of the U.S. military. I mean, look, in FEMA's defense, there are things after this hurricane that FEMA simply could not do. You actually need military command and control. You need military resources deployed to the area. And I think all the president has said is, frankly, what some of Kamala Harris's surrogates have said, which is that if these areas were a little bit more democratic, maybe Kamala Harris would have focused on them more. That acknowledgement is not to attack, frankly, the good folks of FEMA. It's to suggest that Americans are feeling left behind by their government, which they are, Martha.
Okay,
if you talk to folks on the ground, I've had friends that have been in Boone, North Carolina, helping with the cleanup. It is an extraordinary sense of betrayal and being left behind. People are worried that their government doesn't care about them. I'm much more worried about the incompetence of Kamala Harris's administration that led to that more than
Senator
I am
Vance,
the fact that Donald
Senator
Trump
Vance, I'm just going to say that local officials and FEMA officials.
Make no mistake about it, the response from Hurricane Helene from the federal government and FEMA was atrocious. It should have been handled exponentially better, and simply, a lot of people just felt abandoned. The only thing I'm wondering about it, is this just incompetence from this administration? Are they not capable of providing aid in a timely manner if a natural disaster or anything like that happens? Or did they say, you know, the area that was hit was heavily Trump-leaning, let's take our time on this. I'm not sitting here pointing fingers. All I'm saying is this situation was handled terribly, and somebody has to answer for that.
Just flat wrong. But I want to, we played some other comments about migrants, including in Aurora, in Colorado, where Trump said the city had been invaded and conquered by Venezuelan gangs. The Republican mayor of the city said flatly the city and state have not been taken over or invaded or occupied by migrant gangs. So do you support Donald Trump making those claims that the Republican mayor says were grossly exaggerated and have hurt the city's identity and sense of safety? I understand what you're saying, that some people left behind, but he's making these statements that the mayor is flat out disputing.
Well, Martha, you just said the mayor said they were exaggerated.
Grossly exaggerated.
That means there's got to be some element of truth here. And of course, President Trump was actually in Aurora, Colorado, talking to people on the ground. And what we're hearing, of course, Martha, is that people are terrified by what has happened with some of these Venezuelan gangs.
Senator Vance, I'm going to stop you because I know exactly what happened.
Martha.
I'm going to stop you. The incidents were limited to a handful of apartment complexes, and the mayor said our dedicated police officers have acted on those concerns. A handful of problems.
Only, Martha, do you hear yourself? Only a handful of apartment complexes in America were taken over by Venezuelan gangs, and Donald Trump is the problem and not Kamala Harris's open border? Americans are so fed up with what's going on, and they have every right to be. And I really find this exchange, Martha, sort of interesting because you seem to be more focused with nitpicking everything that Donald Trump has said rather than acknowledging that apartment complexes in the United States of America are being taken over by violent gangs. I worry so much more about that problem than anything else here. We've got to get American communities in a safe space again. And unfortunately, when you let people in by the millions, most of whom are unvetted, most of whom you don't know who they really are, you're going to have problems like this. Kamala Harris, 94 executive orders that undid Donald Trump's successful border policies. We knew this stuff would happen. They bragged about opening the border, and now we have the consequences, and we're living with it. We can do so much better, but frankly, we're not going to do better, Martha, unless Donald Trump calls this stuff out. I'm glad that he did.
Okay, let's just.
This reporter has lost her damn mind. Does she realize it's not normal for apartment complexes to be overrun by gangs? This should never happen, and the only reason it did is because of the incompetence of this administration, allowing anyone through our borders, unvetted. We have no idea who these people are. I heard a quote that was very interesting recently. It said, when mass amounts of animals move into a new environment, they call that an invasive species. Yet when mass amounts of humans do it, we call it immigration. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm all for immigration. However, we need to know who these people are. We cannot just have these people coming in unchecked. 90% of them could be fantastic people. We don't know the numbers. All that we do know is that it leaves us open for vulnerability. Why would we take this risk? Why don't we only allow people to come in this country that are checked, that we know who they are, they have good references, they won't do heinous crimes to our citizens? Because like it or not, in areas where all these migrants came in, the violent crimes skyrocketed. Meanwhile, the countries in which these migrants came from, their violent crimes plummeted. It does not take a rocket scientist to figure this out, Martha.
They did not invade or take over the city, as Donald Trump said. I want to move on to
just a few apartment complexes, no big deal.
A few apartment complexes that the mayor did not seem was invading the entire city. Let's move on to women and abortion. Donald Trump is leading Kamala Harris in our poll among males by 8 points, but lagging behind Harris by 9 points among females. You said during the debate that you and Trump have more to do to earn back people's trust, specifically as it relates to women and reproductive rights. 56% of those polled support restoring abortion access to what it was under Roe v. Wade. So what would you say specifically to the women watching this morning who believe they should have their own say over their bodies and not the government, either state or federal?
Well, Martha, first of all, what I'd say is that I think renationalizing this entire debate is a big mistake. And I understand that a lot of Americans, according to that poll, apparently disagree with me and President Trump here. But we want to respect Californians. We want to respect Alabamans. We want to respect Pennsylvanians. These folks are going to have different approaches to this particular topic. And I think that what we had in this country for 50 years was a culture war over this particular issue because we had nationalized it. And it's also important, Martha, that while Kamala Harris uses the slogan of returning to Roe versus Wade, she has endorsed policies that go way beyond anything that Roe versus Wade ever meant in this country. Taxpayer-funded abortions for late-term abortions. She's explicitly refused to endorse things like the Born Alive Act, which would protect babies who survive botched abortion. So while she hides behind the popular slogan of Roe versus Wade, Kamala Harris's actual abortion views, I think, are much more radical than even a lot, I think, frankly, most of our pro-choice citizens.
Let me go back again. What would you say to those women who don't want people involved in their individual rights? Kamala Harris is on that side of that, not you.
Well, I think, Martha, that's not right, actually. I think Kamala Harris has taken this so far that a lot of women, if they knew Kamala Harris's actual view and not the slogan, they would recognize that it's far more radical. They can believe in individual autonomy, but also recognize there are, of course, limits here. We don't want to abort 9-month-old babies here, and we don't want to have taxpayers funding it. So I think everybody recognizes there's a right balance to strike. But to answer your question, Martha, what I would say to women is that Donald Trump and I want to make it easier to make the choice of life in the first place. And I know a lot of young women, especially when I was younger, who chose abortion because they feel like they didn't have any options. And what I want to do as a person who admittedly, Martha, wants to protect the most vulnerable members of our society, I'd like to make it easier for women to choose life to begin with. I think that goes to lowering the cost of housing, which of course has skyrocketed under Kamala Harris's administration. I think it's making it easier for working moms to balance work and life and family. There's a lot that we can do to become more pro-family. That's how I think we can best earn back trust. And
Senator,
yes.
I want to get to some other topics here. On the Attorney General,
Sure.
You said on Friday that the most important person in government in a Trump-Vance administration, other than the president, is not you. It would be the Attorney General. Why do you consider that the most important spot, the second most important spot?
Well, one reason, Martha, is just public opinion. And what I mean here is that we really want the American people to believe that we have a fair and equitable administration of justice. If not, the entire sort of system falls apart. You need people to believe that if the Attorney General prosecutes somebody, it's motivated by justice and law and not by politics. And unfortunately,
would Donald Trump go after his political
opponents?
Would Donald Trump go after his political opponents? He suggested that in the past.
Martha, he was president for 4 years, and he didn't go after his political opponents. You know who did go after her political opponents? Kamala Harris, who has tried to arrest everything from pro-life activists to her political opponents.
He said those people who cheated will be prosecuted
as a weapon against people. Well, he said that people who violated our election laws will be prosecuted. I think that's the administration of law. He didn't say people are going to go to jail because they disagree with me. That has, in fact, been the administration and the policy of Kamala Harris, Martha. Look, under the last 3.5 years, we have seen politically motivated after politically motivated prosecution. I'd like us to just get back to a system of law and order where we try to arrest people when they break the law, not because they disagree with the prevailing opinion of the day. And there's a fundamental difference here between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. Donald Trump may agree or disagree on a particular issue, but he will fight for your right to speak your mind without the government trying to silence you. Kamala Harris is explicitly
Senator Vance,
censorship
I want to go back to Donald Trump.
We've got to get a Department of Justice that believes in the First Amendment, Martha. The First Amendment is the bedrock of our Constitution.
Senator,
we have Kamala Harris who doesn't
Senator,
even
we're
believe
just
in
about
it.
out of
Go ahead,
time
Martha.
here. We're just about out of time.
First off, the vice presidential role was never really that intensive. I mean, John Adams himself, when he was VP, he was bored out of his mind because they don't have that many duties. They're basically only there in case the president goes down. And number two, how can she insinuate Trump would go after his political opponents even though he never did it to Hillary Clinton? And a lot of people would say that she broke the law and he never went after her to preserve the peace. But what she said didn't make sense for one reason. She said that Trump would go after his political opponents, and then 10 seconds later, to back up her claim, she said that Trump would go after anyone who broke any election laws. Are you subtly telling us something right now? All that Donald Trump believes in is that everyone should be treated equally under the law, and that has not been happening in Washington, D.C., because so many politicians break the law, do whatever they want, and it's rules for thee and not for me. As for far too long, there has been a two-tiered system of justice, and that is going to come to an end under a Donald Trump administration.
And I want to end with this. In interview after interview, question after question, and in the debate, you refused to say that Donald Trump lost the 2020 election. So I'm just going to assume that if I ask you 50 times whether he lost the election, you would not acknowledge that he did. Is that correct?
Martha, you asked this question. I've been asked this question 10 times in the past couple of weeks. Of course, Donald Trump and I believe there were problems in 2020. You haven't asked about inflation.
No, I'm sorry. Let's stick to this. I know.
The American people want us to talk about how to make their lives better. They don't want us to
say that?
Because because, Martha, I believe that in 2020, when big tech firms were censoring American citizens, that created very serious problems. And by the way, Martha, you're a journalist. You represent the American media. Look at the polling on this. A lot of Americans feel like they were silenced in the run-up to the 2020 election. That is such a bigger issue. That fundamental problem than me and Donald Trump talking about it. And unfortunately,
but
Martha,
I don't understand why you won't just say it if you believe it.
Won't just say what? That I think the 2020 election had some problems? I've said that repeatedly.
Did Donald Trump lose? That's the question, and you know that's the question.
Martha, I've said repeatedly, I think the 2020 election had problems. You want to say rigged? You want to say he won? Use whatever vocabulary term you want. I want to focus on the fact that we had big technology firms censoring our fellow citizens in a way that violated our fundamental rights. The fact that you're so obsessed with what word I use to describe this phenomenon rather than the phenomenon itself suggests something very broken in the American media. If we want to restore trust in American elections and democracy, which I want to do, Martha, we have to talk openly about what happened in 2020. And most importantly, we've got to talk about what happened afterwards. Okay. Americans being unable to afford the basic necessities of middle-class life because Kamala Harris is in the White House.
We're going to leave it right there.
Isn't the job of journalists trying to uncover the truth no matter the consequences? This woman right here is anything but a journalist. This woman is merely a puppet. She is not looking for the truth. She is only trying to paint Donald Trump and JD Vance in a bad light. I don't think anyone could watch this right here and think this was a fair interview. She was only trying to stump him to make him look bad. And if you want to talk about the 2020 election, there is widespread evidence that a lot of funny business happens. I think Dinesh D'Souza created a movie called 2,000 Mules. Check that out. That's very informative. It shows just what happens in that last election. But I'm just saying, this interview right here is why nobody trusts the mainstream media anymore, because it's not news, it's propaganda. And I hope more and more people can see this for what it is. But yeah, let me know your thoughts on this down below. How did JD Vance handle himself and Donald Trump? And also, do you think there were any problems in the 2020 election? Let me know. I'd love to hear that. And if you enjoyed, make sure to smash that like, comment, subscribe, and I wish you guys nothing but the best. Till next time.